Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively's wedding photos have been shadow banned from Pinterest and other wedding planning websites, but people are happy about it. Before I get into the story, I just want to put out a disclaimer. Please do not send any hate to Ryan Reynolds, Blake Lively, or anyone else mentioned in this story. This video is simply meant to report on the news and give some insight on the situation. On December 4th, Pinterest and The Knot Worldwide announced they would be changing their policies to no longer promote wedding venues and content that romanticizes former working plantations. The Knot Worldwide, whose websites include The Knot and Wedding Wire, said they're working on new guidelines to ensure the venues they feature don't use language that glorifies or celebrates Southern plantation history. While plantations can still list themselves as venue on The Knot Worldwide's websites, the company's chief marketing officer says they don't want vendors referring to a history that includes slavery with language like charming and elegant. The officer said, "We want to make sure we're serving all our couples and that they don't feel in any way discriminated against." As for Pinterest, a spokesperson said the website will restrict content that features plantations and is working on removing Google search results for plantation weddings that lead back to Pinterest. While users can still search the site for plantation weddings, they'll see a note advising that some of the content may violate Pinterest policies. In a statement to BuzzFeed News, the Pinterest spokesperson said, "Weddings should be a symbol of love and unity. Plantations represent none of those things. We are working to limit the distribution of this content and accounts across our platform and continue to not accept advertisements for them." The policy changes come after the companies faced pressure from Color of Change, a civil rights advocacy group. Color of Change sent letters to both The Knot Worldwide and Pinterest urging the companies to stop promoting plantations with slave-owning histories. In their letter to The Knot Worldwide, Color of Change wrote, "The decision to glorify plantations as nostalgic sites of celebration is not an empowering one for the Black women and justice-minded people who use your site. Plantations are physical reminders of one of the most horrific human rights abuses the world has ever seen. The wedding industry routinely denies the violent conditions Black people faced under chattel slavery by promoting plantations as romantic places to marry." The Knot Worldwide said they're working with Color of Change on the new guidelines, which will apply to every vendor on its platforms. Dotdash, the parent company of Brides magazine, said they had removed all mentions of plantations from Brides' website. On December 5th, a spokesperson for Zola, another wedding-focused platform, said the company had removed all plantation venues from its website and is evaluating all the weddings on Zola that have been photographed at plantations. And these new policies are starting to come in effect, most notably with Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds' wedding photos. In 2012, Ryan and Blake got married at Boone Hall Plantation, which was one of the filming locations for The Notebook. It also housed as many as 85 enslaved people who made 4 million bricks per year for the plantation, while also harvesting cotton and pecans. With the new Pinterest policies about plantation wedding venues, Blake and Ryan's wedding photos have essentially been shadow banned from the site. Unless you seek them out, you won't be able to find them easily on Pinterest. Many people were surprised to hear that Blake and Ryan got married at a plantation. "I wanted to trend all over that Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively had theirs on a plantation. It needs to be known by far more people. I was today years old when I found out Blake Lively, along with so many other people, have gotten married on a plantation and get their photos taken there too. I'm sorry, what? This is so up." Others were happy the pictures were being shadow banned. So The Knot and Pinterest are removing photos from Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively's plantation wedding. I love it. I literally love to see it. Several people said they couldn't support Blake and Ryan after hearing about where they got married. Just found out Ryan Reynolds got married at a plantation. I'm a huge Deadpool fan. I can no longer enjoy it knowing its star thought a site of and exploitation was a great place to marry. Can never watch a movie with him or Blake again. To this day, I don't trust anyone getting married on a plantation, especially Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively. Some people wondered if the new guidelines would apply to venues in the northern states. I wonder if they are also going to target the venues in the north where there were people who were enslaved. The places I visited in Nashville, Belmead, and Belmont Mansion all told the stories of the enslaved people on the tours of the mansions, reminding us in each room, and it was because of the people they enslaved that they were able to afford these things. And in the last room in the Belmont Mansion, pointing out to us the cushion on the floor of the child's room, basically a dog bed, and that was where the enslaved person who took care of the child slept. End of tour. None of it made me want to be married there. At least in the South, they seem to be trying to change the narrative. In the North, no one wants to admit that there were enslaved people, so they can't even begin to change the narrative. Agreed. I despise the narrative that paints all Southerners as ignorant, uneducated racists. I've lived in the South my whole life, Kentucky and South Carolina. And yes, there are horribly racist people, but there's also an approach to confronting racism. In the Deep South, your two choices are 1. Confront the past, 2. Rewrite the past. Racism and segregation are so sadly entwined with our history that you really can't ignore it. And that's why I think you see more bold approaches to honesty and repentance about the past in the South than in the North. The Deep South is imperfect, but we are far from ignorant, and I'd argue there's more of us acknowledging and repenting of our past than in non-Southern parts of the country. And a few people were concerned about the wedding location being perceived as not being a big deal. Did y'all know Blake Lively got married on a plantation to Ryan Reynolds? Why do we accept this blind display of racism and disregard? Never underestimate white people's ability to white. But this isn't the first time Blake and Ryan have been called out for their plantation wedding or their embracing of pre-Civil War Southern culture. On October 8, 2014, Blake's online lifestyle magazine, Preserve, published a fashion editorial styled by Blake called Allure of Antebellum. Antebellum refers to the period of time before the American Civil War. The spread paid homage to the women of the pre-Civil War South. However, the editorial and the accompanying article seem to only refer to the white, slave-owning class of Southern women. Here are some selections from the article. Georgia peaches, sweet tea, and the enticement of a smooth twang. We all love a bit of Southern charm. These regional mainstays, along with an innate sense of social poise, evoke an unparalleled warmth and authenticity in style and tradition. The term Southern Belle came to fruition during the antebellum period, acknowledging women with an inherent social distinction who set the standards for style and appearance. These women epitomize Southern hospitality with a cultivation of beauty and grace, but even more with a captivating and magnetic sensibility. While at times depicted as coy, these belles of the ball, in actuality, could command attention with the ease of a hummingbird relishing in a pastoral bloom. Like the debutantes of yesteryear, the authenticity and allure still ring true today. Hoop skirts are replaced by flared and pleated A-lines. Oversized straw toppers are transformed into wide-brim floppy hats and wool fedoras. In a Vox article about Preserve's editorial, writer Alex Abad-Santos wrote, "But the bigger point here is that Lively and her team only wrote half the story in this article. Preserve is implicitly referring to the white women of the time, and is ignoring that many of these beacons of beauty and grace with magnetic sensibility were slave owners. While pointing to the fashion sense of the time and place and explaining where design aesthetic comes from is perfectly fine, assigning persona and romanticizing the slave owners strays into a sphere of ignorance and casual racism." And in a Bustle article about the editorial, writer Maitri Suhas wrote, "The Preserve editorial is not an innocent misstep, it is a display of racism, whether Lively intended it to be so or not. I am guessing that she didn't set out to create something so disgusting, but when we discuss race relations, intent does not matter. The damage is still done." Fast forward to 2018. On February 16th, Ryan tweeted, "Believe the hype. All hail the king. Hashtag Wakanda forever." Someone quote tweeted Ryan's tweet and wrote, "You got married on a plantation." And several people called Ryan out in the replies to that tweet. In both controversies, Blake and Ryan did not respond to the backlash. That seems to be the end of the situation for now. So, what's the big issue? The history of plantations, why people want to get married there, and where people can go from here. Before we go any further, it's important to understand the history of plantations and why they're a symbol of dark times for African Americans. Plantations are large estates on which crops are cultivated, usually by residential labor. They're an important part of American history, particularly in the pre-Civil War American South. During this time, a large number of Africans were enslaved on these plantations and held captive as slave labor, forced to grow crops to make their elite white owners wealthy. And the enslaved people faced brutal treatment at the hands of the plantation owners. In the 1850s, while the practice of slavery was becoming a point of contention between the North and the South, New York Daily Times reporter Frederick Olmsted made several trips to the South and published his observations in the paper. Here's an excerpt from one of those reports. Throughout the Southwest, the black people, as a rule, appeared to be worked much harder than in the eastern and northern slave states. They are constantly and steadily driven up to their work, and the stupid, plodding, machine-like manner in which they labor is painful to witness. This was especially the case with the working slave groups. One of them numbered nearly 200 hands, moving across the field in parallel lines with a considerable degree of precision. I repeatedly rode through the lines at a canter without producing the smallest change or interruption in the dogged action of the laborers, or causing one of them, so far as I could see, to lift an eye from the ground. I think it told a more painful story than any I had ever heard of the cruelty of slavery. In a story published on Southern University's online archive of slave narratives, former enslaved person Thomas Brown spoke about how he tried to escape his plantation but was caught. I was severely punished by a board cut full of holes to raise the blisters, then I was hurt with a strap to burst the blisters, which were then salted and peppered. This burned me very badly, and I never tried to run away again. If you want more information on the treatment of enslaved people, I'll link a few resources in the description below. With all this information about the history of plantations, why are some brides so attached to the idea of getting married at one? Chandler Willis Helms, a white bride who got married at Boone Hall, said it was her dream. I have always wanted a plantation wedding. I've always dreamed of getting married at Boone Hall, just because of the location and the history. Everything about Boone Hall is beautiful. Aside from the beauty of the estate, some fans say former plantations operate differently now than in the past. My husband and I were married on a plantation in the South. I chose the location myself. I grew up nearby, and it's a beautiful home and garden that is sort of like a museum and open park now. It was very modern. No one was dressed in antebellum costumes. It was just a beautiful wedding at a beautiful venue. I'm sorry if some people believe these properties should be burned to the ground or left to fall into ruin. The way we see it, we contributed to the preservation of local history. Of course, there were slaves living there once, but that's most places in the South. The slaves were there hundreds of years ago. How long are we going to be offended? My family is from the South, and to my knowledge, they did not own slaves. I have nothing to do with slavery. I'm sure most wedding venues have had problems in the past if you go back far enough. We cannot move forward if we are so focused on the past. I'll be the unpopular opinion here. Why let a perfectly beautiful and reformed piece of property go to waste? Times have changed, and yes, society in some ways still has a way to go, but these properties no longer support slavery. I see no reason to boycott them or make a big deal. I sort of just feel like some people feel the need to take up some moral outrage stance on everything. If you want to get real technical about it, all of America was home to an atrocity as the land was stolen from the Native Americans. So every inch you step on, whether it's named a plantation or not, holds the bloodshed of our ancestors. It just seems silly. You can acknowledge that something terrible happened somewhere, yet still move forward and make good use of the place. However, many people think getting married on a former plantation is in bad taste. I'm a Southerner living elsewhere, and I always thought this plantation wedding was absurd. I have been to a of plantations on historical tours. One thing almost all plantations I visited have mentioned is that they served as field hospitals in the war. Since the Civil War was fought more in the rural Confederacy, the best buildings to make into hospitals were plantation houses. They were appropriately large and habitable. You know what 19th century field surgery was like? Improvised. The floors by the large 19th century windows are still stained with blood. A century and a half later. I can't imagine a worse place to say I do. Maybe a cemetery? The vibes are bad, man. Black women here. There is no way in hell I would go to a plantation wedding. Seriously. To be celebrating on the land where people were enslaved and degraded in every way imaginable gets a firm 4 thumbs down from me. I'd rather get married in a Burger King bathroom. And for black people to be the ones throwing a wedding at the plantation is even worse. Why the didn't somebody say something? Sheesh. The issue is glamorizing plantations takes away from the reality of what happened on that land. It's a gross portrayal of history. I know Charleston is a really popular bachelorette destination and girls getaway, but I don't know a single black person who with Charleston like that. I was talking to some friends one time about Charleston, and they said there's an unspoken spookiness to Charleston given the history. They said the racial divide is still very apparent. I haven't been, but the way I've had black girlfriends describe feeling like they don't belong, and the disgust with how much people locals are able to have in the history of the place makes me never want to visit. I just can't with the fact that even in 2019, people still don't understand how disgusting slavery was. People don't understand the amount of destruction it did and continues to have on the black family unit, how those feelings of hatred were so pervasive. I'm not sure what people are taught in schools, but I don't know why folks repeatedly tell people to get over it as if what happened hasn't created our current situations. One person explained why the pre-Civil War South is often romanticized. The whole romanticizing of the Old South is a direct result from the organization United Daughters of the Confederacy, rewriting the history books distributed in schools throughout the South. They morphed the vicious wound of slavery, founding a nation on slavery and race relations throughout the US, into this nostalgic sentimentality about loyal slaves, kind and noble masters, and an agrarian civilization destroyed by the North. This is how we end up with people having weddings and Old South balls on top of unmarked mass graves. But with all this being said, there are some people of color who said they would attend a wedding hosted at a former plantation. I've attended a wedding at a plantation. My date and I were the only brown people there who weren't working. Thing is, this is America, and there aren't really places to go where there haven't been atrocities. If you live in an old city and like old places, all those places had slaves or indentured servants or marriages or were stolen from indigenous people or other terrible stuff. I got married in a gorgeous old house in New Orleans that definitely had slaves in it. Now it's owned by incredibly liberal gay dudes who gave me zero shade about being black or entering an interracial marriage, something you can't always count on down here. I'd rather give them business than penalize them for buying a house where bad things happened. I would attend a wedding on a plantation. I wouldn't have one there myself though. The plantations down here are actually quite amazing venues that are renovated for weddings. I see why people would not want to attend one at a plantation though. I've attended a wedding at a plantation and it was absolutely amazing. It was beautifully dressed. To be honest, I doubt anyone really thought or cared about the historical connotation. Most were just amazed by the venue's beauty. The plantation was viewed as exactly that, a venue and nothing else. One bride, who is a person of color, said she didn't see a problem with the plantation wedding. As a person of color and a bride in the South, honestly, I don't see the problem with plantation weddings. They are beautiful properties and make for great pictures. My wedding will be at an old tobacco farm turned wedding venue. It's beautiful. I think it's just the mindset that you have towards it. And another person explained why it might mean something different for a black bride to get married at a plantation as opposed to a white bride. I think there's a big difference between a black woman saying, I'm going to be treated like a queen here today, and a white woman's antebellum power fantasy though. A black woman choosing to have her wedding on a plantation? Honestly, I'm 100% for it. The people who own that land would spin in their graves fast enough that you could hook them to some wires and power the Phoenix metro area. But when white women have weddings in these places, it isn't an acknowledgement of freedom, of survival, a face-spitting defiance, or we lived. It's some frill wanting to imagine that she is a wealthy Southern belle, living the life that could only exist when you stood on the backs of other human beings. It's just not the same. So with all of these perspectives, where do we go from here? It seems that education about plantations and what happened to enslaved people in America is the most important thing. Some people say it matters how transparent the former plantation is about its history. As someone who has worked in historic preservation and who grew up and lives in Northern Virginia, I think the biggest thing to consider is how open the site is about its slave-owning past. Does the museum website talk about workers or enslaved peoples? Does the museum mention enslaved people who live at the site by name? Most sites in Nova do this right. Blenheim's museum focus is on Union graffiti, but their copy is respectful of the enslaved family who lived on site. Problematic historic wedding venues, in my opinion, would be ones who use phrases like plantation wedding or Southern belle wedding in their copy, those whose history page only mentioned the white family who lived there, or those who are used only as an event venue without any ties to a museum or municipality. One person who was involved in museum studies said the money from weddings goes towards education about slavery. Full disclosure, I went to school in the South and have a degree in museum studies, but I no longer work in the nonprofits. The only part part of this that gives me pause is that revenue from events like weddings provides a lot of, in some cases, much needed funding for sites, many of which are working diligently to rewrite the traditional docent narrative. The new generation of museum educators, curators, directors, etc. appear to be very committed to telling the entire, often grisly story of these homes, with quite a bit of pushback from older, more traditional visitors. But in order to hire these people to study the lives of the enslaved people, to write the content, to develop the exhibits, to publicize them, it takes money. And revenue from weddings is big money for these sites. Without this new generation of educators and curators, we run the risk of slipping back to a place where volunteers repeat the old script of the great white men and their dainty wives who lived there. We run the risk of going back to a mindset where Sally Hemings's room is turned into a bathroom because she's less important than her white master because it matters greatly, to borrow a phrase from Hamilton, who tells the story. For any number of reasons that aren't completely relevant here, Americans romanticize this era, and the best weapon to change that mindset is education, and education takes money. And education is an important factor. Several people pointed out how a lack of education about slavery led to people not understanding the horrors that occurred at plantations. In my experience, Americans aren't taught much, if anything, about slavery in school. US history classes have a lot to cover in just a year. How ridiculous that we only cover US history for 1 year in high school, and they spent a ton of time on the big wars, and not as much on anything else. I don't remember getting to slavery in my high school US history class. I think it was covered a little bit in middle school, but it's definitely not given the time that it should. And with all the standardized testing, younger grades may not get to social studies, let alone a topic like slavery at all. It's really sad and just contributes to the "it's not a big deal, get over it" problem. Basically, growing up, it was slavery is bad, so then the Civil War happened, the end. I've had to learn and research a lot on my own to know what I know now, or I learned it in college. However, many people believe that while education is important, it's still inappropriate to host a wedding at a site that was the backdrop for so many atrocities. There are some plantations that are doing it right, in my opinion, and you can't deny their beauty, but they aren't a place to be married. A plantation used for educational purposes is one thing, but they should not be used as party venues. For many people, there's no clear-cut answer to this situation. Plantations are objectively beautiful estates, and it's easy to understand why people want to get married there, but they also represent a dark time in American history, especially for Black people, and that cannot be forgotten. The money from weddings held at plantations may help fund more accurate education about enslaved people's lives on these plantations, and that's a good thing. Plus, it may be harder for people getting married in the South to find venues that aren't tainted with a dark past, but for many people, it still feels wrong to get married on land where so many people suffered. Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds are public figures with a lot of influence. With an issue as sensitive as a plantation wedding, it's important for them to acknowledge the controversy and explain their decision. It could help educate people on the real issues associated with plantations and their role during a brutal part of America's past. What do you think about this story? What do you think about plantation weddings? Let me know in the comments below.